Also wanted to ask you, and you just touched on it then, why do you think intelligence assets appear to be so active in the disclosure or non-disclosure of UAPs and UFOs at the moment?
Well, so during the Cold War, the U.S. intelligence agencies were involved with the UFO phenomena. So there were intelligence officers, for example, um, within Project Blue Book and also outside Project Blue Book that shared this perspective. So in August 1952, the CIA produced three briefing papers aimed at evaluating the Air Force's UFO study and its implications for intelligence. So during the Cold War, the CIA was concerned that the UFO sightings could be utilized by the Soviets as a psychological warfare tactic. They noted that the US air warning system relied on radar and visual observation, and that a coordinated attack alongside a surge of UFO reports could overwhelm the system. Their paper concluded that, while the Air Force study was valid, further investigation into psychological warfare implications was necessary. So, although UFOs were not considered a direct threat, panelists agreed that hostile nations could exploit UFO reports to disrupt air defense communication or undermine trust in the government, which I think has happened. They recommended that the government, demystify UFOs and educate the public to recognize genuine signs of hostile intent. But and then later on, during the 1970s and 80s, the agency produced documents on counterintelligence aspects of UFOs, including concerns about Soviet use of UFOs to gather intelligence on stealth aircraft. Ex-Captain Ruppelt was among the first whistleblowers, revealing hidden government activities related to UFOs, which challenged the official stance and supported theories of extraterrestrial involvement and cover-ups. So there's been a long history of intelligence involvement and the UFO phenomena. The Captain Ruppelt, he discussed the schism in Project Sign. That was also related to Project Blue Book. I'd like to think of that as the X-Files. So, regarding UFOs as alien spacecraft, he noted that some Air Force intelligence officers supported this view as well. So people within the intelligence community believed that there were, extraterrestrial involvement. But obviously, we can't say that for sure. But he speculated that, as head of Blue Book, that they might actually be an unwitting front for a more covert UFO intelligence project. And Vice Admiral Roscoe Hillen-Cotter, former CIA director, was also a significant board member of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. And when that ended, we had MUFON and other UFO organizations that came along. So there's been a sort of a long history of interconnection between those two fields. I think there's a lot of psyop going on with the UFO phenomena and intelligence agencies. So I think there's a lot of disinformation that comes out of the way that intelligence agencies try and frame how UFOs are seen by the public. So yeah, so there are historical relations, and there's a historical background to this out of the Cold War.
Thank you. The character of James Bond is ostensibly based on John Dee, a mathematician, mystic courtier, and possibly a spy for Queen Elizabeth I, who would sign his name as 007, which was actually a depiction of a lorgnette when sending coded message back to her. So I wanted to ask you, is this mystical layer still present in the modern intelligence community that you're aware of?
I think this is probably one of the most interesting areas in the field of intelligence that's hardly touched upon. But the evidence is there and can be accessed in the archives. There's always been a link between spying and the occult. It's been explored in both fiction and real life. You know, there's a novel called They Use Dark Forces by Dennis Wheatley, which tells the story of British and Nazi magicians fighting to end the Second World War. Some believe that Aleister Crowley, the famous occultist, worked for British intelligence during World War One. His character inspired McCarthy and Dennis Wheatley's 1934 novel, Devil Rides Out, The Devil Rides Out. Wheatley himself worked for the London Controlling Section, which was a secret department responsible for coordinating strategic military deception during the Second World War. He was involved in planning for D-Day and potentially Operation Mincemeat, one of the most impressive military deceptions in history. And, you know, we've got Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, 007, who was also part of naval intelligence. He drew inspiration from his, from his experiences for his character James Bond. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting that John Dee signed his confidential correspondence to Queen Elizabeth using the two circles, which symbolized that he was the Queen's secret eyes. And that was guarded with a root sign. I'd have to think about that. You know, yeah, so intelligence and the occult are closely related. You know, if we look at it in loose terms, spies are always on the quest to break down the barriers between what's known and what's unknown and reveal the hidden truth. It's also heavily involved in wild looking glass war taking place in a sort of wilderness of mirrors. The CIA and FBI, MI5 agents experimented with parapsychology and LSD for the same purposes during the Cold War. I'm not entirely sure whether that's still going on, but it's evolved from that sort of traditional way of how, you know, the occult works, I think. I'll get to that in a second. So yeah, they've attempted previously to employ esoteric knowledge, if you like. For 20 years, the US Army, then the Defense Intelligence Agency, and finally the CIA sponsored teams of remote viewers as part of their more esoteric intelligence collection arsenal. They didn't get involved, without millions of dollars in testing by prestigious academic research units like the Stanford Research Institute. But currently, I think the occult has surfaced through the cyber domain. You know, if we go back to the Snowden revelations, hidden among the avalanche of documents that he leaked, there were images from a PowerPoint presentation that said, that showed a shot of hands shuffling a deck of cards. And it said, "We want to build cyber magicians." And I think that's a very important observation today, because I think that's how the evolution between the occult and intelligence has happened. I think it's in the infusion with the cyber domain. And that's one of the reasons why, if anyone wants to, increase their chances of being accepted into the intelligence community nowadays, I think they'd have to spend a lot of time learning about softwares and how to analyze data. So I think it's changed from that the traditional way of how the occult works. I think it's turned into the cyber domain, and I think that's partly a dark magic. I think that so the dark arts of technology.
Well, with that said, who do the intelligence agencies ultimately work for?
Wow, that's a great question. So consumers, the intelligence consumers might include policymakers, members of the intelligence community itself, overseers such as congressional committee members, or in the United States, it could be the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. That's the obvious answer. The superficial answer. Policymakers.
What's the real answer?
I think I mentioned the cyber domain, and I think if we look behind that, we'd see that a lot of corporations are behind that element. So I'd like to mention Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote a book called Surveillance Capitalism. So she discusses surveillance capitalism, and she talks a lot about how big tech companies like Google, Facebook, Meta, and Twitter, and so on, all these corporations that are behind surveillance nowadays, they have a lot of influence within government. And, you find a lot of former intelligence operatives, analysts working for these same organizations when they leave the CIA, the FBI, or the NSA, for example. So all of these, there's a lot of interconnection between the government organizations and corporations. And I'd say that ultimately the intelligence agencies work for these organizations nowadays. So I don't think I think there's a lot of talk about how there's a sort of a secret government club, basically, that's all intelligence related or that's covered up. You come across that in X-Files, for example. The smoking man. I think in reality it's the corporations. So
that's interesting. So I'm just kind of curious then. Is the intelligence protocol the same across the world, or does it sort of fluctuate based on countries or democracy versus monarchy versus communist? Like, does everybody follow the same rules, or is it sort of everybody does what they do?
Well, I think there exists at least one recognizable difference between respective intelligence cultures. Yeah, it varies. I mean, the British intelligence community is different to the American intelligence community. I mean, there's the hierarchy in the British intelligence community is organized very differently. It's more hierarchical. In America, the intelligence agencies are more independent, I think, and obviously they've got a huge budget. I mean, there's Sir David Omand, who I mentioned earlier, the head of GCHQ, once said that we in the British intelligence community, we're the brains, and the Americans have the money. So,
Sorry, Mike.
I don't think that's true. I think that's just Oxford and Cambridge fantasy. I don't think that's true at all. But yeah, I mean, that's Yeah, I think there's a lot of there's a huge difference between the intelligence communities around the world, and yeah, I mean the communist intelligence agencies, for example, historical texts about the work of spies and how intelligence worked in, for example, the former Soviet Union. There's a lot of there's evidence that Stalin, for example, used politicized intelligence. In other words, he used it for his own personal gain. So I'm studying the African intelligence communities at the moment, and I come across a lot of corruption. For example, politicians use the intelligence agencies to silence their opponents, their political opponents. And that's happened in South Africa, for example. And that came out recently that there was a huge scandal, and the former president was actually sort of had to resign. So, yeah, I mean, it really depends on how intelligence, on the history of the country, on their political, setup. And all I can say is that no intelligence agency in the world is, I think, that is good. I don't think they are at all. By definition, I don't think they can have you can't say they work for good. So,
Reverend David, I wanted to ask you because I think it was our very first conversation with you, you had mentioned that you had seen a flying saucer in the schoolyard, and I didn't really delve too much into it at the time, but I think you said like the teachers basically said, "Oh, enough about those flying saucers." But did the Men in Black ever show up to that or after that and tell you all to keep quiet, or that you didn't see what you saw?
I've got to say a few things before I answer that wonderful question. Isn't he wonderful? I know I'm biased, but isn't Daniele wonderful?
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
been
Um,
fantastic.
My trouble with a poor script is that everything has to be scripted. I'm going to answer for once in a slightly more sober fashion. My background. I'm the Reverend Monsignor, therefore I'm a senior priest with the Old Catholic Apostolic Church. I'm the author of over 70 publications, and I'm just about to be awarded my second doctorate. Why am I saying that? If all we're looking at is a government agency frightening people, and I don't doubt that happens, but maybe that's not the whole point of the Men in Black. Maybe there's something else there. Then yes, X happens, weird stuff goes on, the government turns up, shut it or else, the end. But the Men in Black, when those stories started, were barely human. That seems to be forgotten nowadays. They were strangely pale, if not blanched white. They couldn't hold on to a situation for long. Steam would sometimes literally come from them. They needed glasses of water unless they were overcome with something. They were barely human. Those stories have changed. And if we're actually talking about something Manichaean, there are forces of light appearing in these glorious orbs, these silvery objects. Surely the forces of darkness would also turn up to try and counter that situation. There's now too much light in the world. We're going to try and oppose that. So the answer would be, if there was no such thing as karma, higher bodies, if the whole thing was one-dimensional and only nuts and bolts in a nuts and bolt universe, then yes, government agencies would come along and suppress information. But just supposing those other things are true, and everyone is at a different spiritual level, and these other forces know that, and maybe the karma of a situation is so complex that they wouldn't be able to interfere. Therefore, they'd want to interfere, but they can't. The karma of a particular group, some shooting off to the stars, others going in a normal direction, would disable that as an option for these dark forces. They simply wouldn't be able to. Therefore, if we're looking at a one-dimensional nuts and bolts universe, which we simply aren't, you know, and actually, yeah, the teachers were very clear. As I said, I've never forgotten it, because it destroyed my belief in education, mainstream education that day. We don't, I quote, after all these years, we don't want any more talk of UFOs. The end. And, you know, we were kids, therefore, no, we all got on with our lessons. We thought it was wrong and we thought it was ridiculous, but we all got on with our lessons. No government agency or no Men in Black turned up, but for the reasons I've just outlined. If it was simply if they were simply human beings working on the control of information, which I've no doubt happens, by the way, you know, I think the Men in Black phenomena, again, it's lots of different things rolled into one ball. The real Men in Black, the ones that still occasionally turn up, that make bewilderingly strange statements, and then go, and everybody's left wondering what the hell has just happened. They don't think, now I'm intimidated by a G-man. That's the American term, isn't it? You know, some beefy guy that used to play college football is gunning for me. That's not what they used to say. I've only seen one bit of footage, and I don't spend my time trawling the internet, but I've only seen one bit of footage that was meant to be about, you know, of Men in Black that actually looked like Men in Black. They were so pale it was untrue. They moved with such a bewildering gait. Everybody noticed them in the lobby of the place they were walking through. And apparently, to follow on the story from that particular clip, they turned up, asked weird questions like, have you seen a UFO? And the people have all said yes. Then they left. You know, you're looking at something deeper and darker and much more complex. Let's work on the premise. If I'm going on too long, shut me up. Let's work on the premise that not everyone is on the same spiritual level. Something I detest as an idea. I'm an old-fashioned libertarian, not the way that word is being used in America at the moment. I think that's been kidnapped by a certain group for certain reasons. You know, I like believing in human equality and human liberty, but one of the most ancient ideas in the world, shared by all the great religions in different forms, is that we're not all equal. Some are beginning their spiritual journey, they're young souls. Others are finishing their spiritual journey. They've been here time and time and time again, and there's no need for them to stay. You know, therefore, human beings simply aren't looking at the world in the same way from the same level. It's incredibly complicated. Then we get to the idea of different bodies. I mean, I brought that up before. You know, sort of we've astral bodies, we've etheric bodies, all of which can operate independently of each other. There's always a link. You know, there's always these magical threads, metaphorical or otherwise, but they can act independently. Therefore, what really is being addressed by the UFO phenomena, and what would the Men in Black be trying to oppose? Which body are they trying to work on? To answer the guy that doesn't believe in magic again, it's not here. Is there any magic on this world? No. There we are. The paranormal can happen here because look at the word itself. Quasi-normal, partially normal, an extension of the sensorium that we all live in. Therefore, telepathy is conceivable, precognition is conceivable, none of which is occultism. It can be used in an occult fashion, but none of it is occultism. If I want to, or if somebody wants to work an act of magic, the first thing they will do is prepare all they need on the astral realm and let it trickle down to this one. There is no magic here, but that doesn't mean there aren't magical effects here. So these entities may not even be addressing the physical body or the physical phenomena. I mean, what is it they actually don't want discussed? I find that fascinating. They don't want the intrusion of freedom, transcendence, The fact there might be more to life than we think. There's more than the nuts and bolts around us. You are a complex, beautiful, spiritual being with all of these facets and dimensions. That's exactly what they don't want discussed. So all of a sudden, to my mind, excuse me, we're looking at much more than a government agency, because look at what it's trying to oppose and the way it's trying to oppose it. And the real men in black are nearly incapable of doing that. They try hard, but they can't. They can't because of what they're dealing with. How about that for a long-winded answer? Any thoughts?
That was
That's
fascinating.
fantastic.
So no, I mean, no men in black turned up because simply they couldn't on that occasion. The karma, the collective karma of the situation wouldn't have allowed that to occur. And that, by the way, is why men in black don't always turn up. Sometimes they can't. The forces of transcendence, or the astral body of somebody, or the etheric body of somebody, is simply too powerful for them to deal with. I mean, right, getting back to occultism, then I will shut up. Not all the same bodies are at the same level of development, they say. And certainly the birth of the physical body gives birth to the embryo of an astral body, which gives birth to the embryo of an etheric body, and so on and so on and so on. Remember, there are meant to be 7 bodies in all. But it doesn't always work that way, because of the world and the way it is, the traumas of life, the sadnesses, the delights. Sometimes a different body to our own physical body is much more active and healthy and complete than this one. It's easy to imagine someone in a wheelchair actually focusing those energies to a different part of themselves. Most people would put that down to fantasy, and a lot of the time it is. But maybe it's also not entirely that. They're working on a different body where that isn't necessary. They get motion in a different way. We've got to. Why is ufology so important for me? Because it opens up questions like this. What are we as human beings? So, why would these visitors, and some of them are, to my mind, simply that. Why would they come here in the first place? Why? We're on the distant edges of the Milky Way. Why? All the big guns are in the middle somewhere where there's no darkness. The stars are so large and bright, everything is perpetual daylight. So what, billions and billions and trillions of years older than us, what would a being from that particular matrix, what interest could they possibly have in us? You know, uh, uh, why? But things allegedly come here from other dimensions or not. They take an interest in us for whatever reason, and they move on. And nobody, as usual, is asking the right question. In my humble mind, why? Why would that happen? How do they benefit? What's it got to do with them? The bit that always amuses me in ufology circles, the endless survey. God's sake, get it done and dusted. Give yourselves a break. Because human beings can do that now. Why can't they do it? And they can't do it because that's not what they're doing. One of the government agencies, I mean, Daniele's the expert, not me. The 100% thing I agree on is, what are they afraid of? The implications of this subject. The implications of MoveOn. I bet they hate MoveOn. The implications of Stuart being a minister. The implications of discussions like this. Because all of a sudden, big questions are on the table. I used to watch sometimes, I don't spend a lot of time, shame on me perhaps, watching UFO Hunter. The theatricality, it was a show, UFO Hunters, the theatricality of the show was always so wonderful. You get the guy, I can't remember his name, who believes absolutely everything. You stubbed your toe and a UFO caused it. He's running around the world interviewing people. What did you think of this? Then you always get the skeptic. If an alien's patting him on the shoulder, he doesn't believe it. It's great theatre. The one episode I did see that caught my attention, and which I thought probably was the most important thing they ever did, was a very rich guy on a yacht who'd seen a UFO, excuse me, and wished he hadn't seen it. Oh, bullseye.
Yeah.
Bullseye. Because all of a sudden, you're in a bigger world that you can't control. There are forces and energies way beyond you and your corporation and your little lives and your little dreams, which is exactly what he didn't want. And that's why these shows, ufology, movement, and the rest of it, at the moment they want to ridicule drones. There were no drones 40 years ago, so talk about drones back then. I noticed the whole of that phenomena is being geared towards drones. There were no drones once. There were no drones during World War II and the Foo Fighters. Save it, please. So it's all about aggregates, isn't it? How many people will not really think about these issues and go for that story? Every single episode of this show that's broadcast is a threat. These questions are a threat. You two are a threat. I'm a threat, bewilderingly. Daniele's a threat. And you've got to start asking why and who's doing this and what are they gaining by trying to stop these types of conversation. I think the footsteps of visitors, the glittering footsteps of those others on every continent, in every time period, they surround us. And that's the sort of knowledge that these people don't want.
Well said. We've had our challenges for sure, getting some of these conversations out there. There have been times that I needed to change specific words and titles and or images to allow them to be put out. There's definitely some censorship happening for sure. And I was really shocked at first because when I sort of started on this journey with Stuart doing this, I wasn't expecting that to happen at all. And it did almost right away, and it happened multiple times. Just a couple episodes ago too again. So, I mean, yeah, for sure. Well said. So, Daniele, do you have any, alpha, right? For any folks out there, like younger folks maybe who are tuning in and want to be a spy or work in the intelligence community, what would your advice be to them about that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think
check out the entire conversation with the link in the description or the next up screen and discover all the conversations in the Universal Disclosure Podcast library. We have over 82 hours of consciousness expanding conversation spread amongst 57 episodes and counting. Smart people from all over the world are joining this conversation, and you can be next. What do you have to share with us?